And that concludes portfolio questions. And we'll now move to the next item of business, which is a debate on motion number 6153 in the name of Maureen Watt on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee on Public Procurement Reform. I'd invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible, and I would call on Gordon MacDonald to speak to and move the motion on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Mr MacDonald, 10 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, it's a pleasure to open this debate on public procurement on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. As members will be aware, the Scottish Government intends to introduce its much-anticipated Public Procurement Reform Bill in the coming months. However, it is not intended that this debate should only be about the forthcoming bill, but an opportunity for colleagues to express views more generally on how the public procurement process in Scotland currently operates and, importantly, how these might be improved. The ICI Committee has an interest in the means by which major transport, broadband and water and sewerage infrastructure projects and services are procured. But other committees also have a direct interest in relation to health, education and local government capital projects and services. In order to place in context the importance of ensuring our procurement processes are fit for purpose, I feel it is essential to highlight the scale of public procurement in Scotland and its huge significance in terms of our economy. Spending by the public sector in Scotland on goods and services comes to more than £9 billion per year, and when added to spending on infrastructure investment and other capital projects, the total comes to more than £11 billion per year. Including a geographical share of North Sea oil, this amounts to over 7.5% of our GDP. The recently published Progress Report on Public Contracts Scotland highlights that Scotland now has one of the best records in Europe when it comes to procurement from the SME sector, with 82% of contracts advertised on Public Contracts Scotland being won by SMEs. The public procurement regime in Scotland operates within an EU-wide framework which aims to ensure the free movement of supplies, services and works within the EU and the non-discriminatory treatment of suppliers. Therefore, it highlights the competitiveness of Scottish companies that, despite the level of European competition, they still win 68% of contracts in Scotland.
Would the member give way?
Yes.
I thank the member for giving way. He mentions the EU, and we do sometimes hear criticism of the EU for a variety of reasons, but would he confirm what I think he's just said, which is that it gives an opportunity for Scottish companies to compete on a level playing field?
Okay. Gordon MacDonald.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and actually I'm just going to move on to that point. So the EU-wide framework also opens up opportunities for Scottish companies, as the scale of procurement by the public sector across the EU is huge. In 2010, public procurement across the EU totalled €2.4 trillion. However, I have also become very aware that during almost every recent piece of work carried out by the ICI Committee, we have consistently heard about the importance of getting the procurement process right if we are to ensure the delivery of high-quality, cost-effective and sustainable public infrastructure and services. I am aware that the forthcoming bill will have sustainability at its heart. The bill will establish a more transparent and streamlined national framework for sustainable public procurement, which supports Scotland's national and local economic growth by ensuring that public procurement delivers economic, social and environmental benefits. Sustainable procurement can contribute to a reduction in greenhouse emissions through the use of more responsible or locally sourced low-carbon materials. It can also serve to encourage and foster innovation amongst suppliers, leading to an increase in the availability and effectiveness of sustainable products and services. Importantly, however, a more sustainable approach to procurement can lead to the higher levels of contracting or subcontracting to SMEs, leading to the creation of local jobs. Contracts should also allow for the improvement and development of skills through professional or vocational apprenticeships, or by offering opportunities that are long-term unemployed. The Committee has heard of good practice already being applied in this regard on both the Forth Replacement Crossing and M74 construction projects. When the ICI Committee comes to scrutinise the bill, we will need to consider what might be done to engage with those businesses that currently have difficulties in implementing sustainable procurement. They could be constrained by a lack of resources, appropriate skills, perceived costs, capacity, or lack of senior executive or organisational support. We will need to consider and understand the whole life value of a product or service as opposed to the initial upfront cost, as well as to other benefits such as reduction in carbon emissions or waste generated. Adopting a whole life value approach to procurement is fundamental to delivering a sustainable solution. For example, the construction of a new building accounts for only 15% of its lifetime greenhouse gas emissions, so it is imperative to ensure that new buildings are designed with high energy efficiency standards and that all equipment, utilities and services required throughout its lifetime are procured with sustainability in mind. Another key objective of the reform agenda is to make the procurement process more streamlined and accessible. The bill proposals are likely to propose the further development of a single portal for bids, building on the existing Public Contracts Scotland portal. This is essential if we are serious about making it easier for businesses, particularly SMEs, to access public contract and subcontracting opportunities. We must also recognise the importance of the third sector and the need to ensure that the proposed improvements provide enhanced opportunities for engagement by social enterprises in the procurement process. I note that the Scottish Government is shortly to produce a report setting out the detail of how this might work, and this will certainly be of interest to the ICI Committee and to others who will wish to provide input to the bill scrutiny process. I note that some of the responses to the Scottish Government's public consultation, mainly from local authorities, executive agencies and quangos, who raised the issue of resources and identified the need for shared service agreements to help minimise costs and any burden on resources. This is an approach that is already well advanced amongst groups of local authorities in Scotland, and the recent establishment of the single police force and fire service is another very obvious example of how sharing of services can deliver cost savings and other benefits. It would be useful to hear views on what more can be done to help facilitate and further develop this approach. We cannot ignore the fact that the European Commission is currently conducting a comprehensive review of the EU procurement directives. It is clearly essential that the proposed bill is compliant with the updated EU directives when they emerge. We must, of course, remind ourselves that we already have been making good progress on procurement in the public sector in recent years, and in some areas excelling. Last year, for example, Scottish Water became the first Scottish organisation and the world's first water utility to achieve gold certificate status from the Chartered Institute of Purchasing and Supply. However, we need to examine how good and innovative procurement practices can best be harnessed and shared with other public bodies so that the wider benefits can be realised. We need to develop the skills and training on procurement across the public sector to ensure that good practice and the improvements to be introduced by the reform agenda can be implemented. To summarise, Presiding Officer, I believe the aims of the Procurement Reform Bill will be welcomed, as it will establish a legal framework for sustainable public procurement that supports Scotland's economic growth. It will help ensure that we get additional value from procurement, especially on major contracts. The additional value could be economic, social or environmental. It will strengthen and improve existing procurement legislation and guidelines, removing inconsistencies. It will make doing business with the public sector simplified, more transparent and more accessible to suppliers, especially SMEs. It will strike the right balance in delivering benefits without adding unnecessary costs or risks. And it will further promote the use of community benefit clauses that have already provided over 3,500 training and employment opportunities. So I look forward to hearing the views of other members on these and other issues during this debate. I am sure that the Cabinet Secretary will also be paying attention to what is said this afternoon as the Government refines and finalises its legislative proposals. I move motion S4M 06153 in the Convener's name.
Many thanks. We are extraordinarily tight for time today, so I now call on Nicola Sturgeon. Up to 10 minutes, please, Ms Sturgeon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As Gordon MacDonald has just said, Scottish public bodies spend over £9 billion of taxpayers' money every single year. So it stands to reason that the decisions they make when they spend that money are of enormous consequence to businesses, to the public and to the economy generally. So I'm very pleased that the Infrastructure Committee has called this debate, and I very much look forward to hearing contributions from members across the Chamber today. I'm going to talk a bit about progress today, but in doing that I don't want to leave anybody in any doubt that there is still room for significant improvement in the way that the public sector buys goods, works and services, and I hope we hear lots of suggestions this afternoon about how we continue to make those improvements. But firstly, I do want to focus on some of the progress. The approach we've taken to procurement in recent years has allowed us to deliver £1.2 billion of savings, over 3,500 training and employment opportunities through community benefit clauses, a national framework for supported businesses, a situation where 46% of our £9 billion procurement spending is with SMEs. That's compared to a UK Government target of 25%, and nearly half of that goes directly to small firms employing fewer than 50 people. We've got an e-commerce shared service platform that supports over 100 public bodies and processes over £5 billion of transactions every year. And as I announced yesterday at the new crime campus at Gartcosh, we now have a situation where 80% of suppliers awarded contracts through the Public Contract Scotland portal are based in Scotland, and 68% are Scottish-based SMEs. That's up 12% since 2010. So the fact is that more Scottish-based businesses than ever before are winning business with the Scottish public sector through PCS, and I think we should celebrate that. But there is much work still to do. The variety of frustrations that I regularly hear from the business community, in particular the small business community, about procurement processes leaves me in absolutely no doubt about that. And our package of public procurement reform initiatives are designed, as far as it is reasonably possible, to address in a systematic and ongoing way as many of these frustrations as we can. Before I talk more about particular aspects of the reform programme, I think it is necessary to mention the EU context. Public procurement, as everybody in the Chamber knows, is governed by a detailed, comprehensive and often very complex suite of European laws. These laws are themselves the product of a policy that, at a pan-European level, is intended to promote economic growth by opening up markets. We might not agree with every aspect of European law. In fact, we don't agree with every aspect of European law. And my view is that we should always strive to operate with maximum flexibility within these rules, but we are nevertheless bound by these rules. And we've also got to remember a point that was made already in the debate, that Scottish businesses themselves benefit from these rules when they win contracts internationally, as they frequently do. However, seeking to influence European law and procurement is important, and I've been very pleased to see the cross-party collaboration of our members of the European Parliament in trying to shape the review of European procurement law that is underway. Last year they tabled an amendment to the new draft European Public Procurement Directive that, if adopted, would have allowed purchasers to take account of economic impact in their purchasing decisions. Ministers have also supported that position directly with the Commission. Now, so far we've not been successful in securing that change, but that should not, will not, must not deter us from continuing to lobby vigorously at EU level for sensible reform. It's also the case that, yes.
Mr Harvey. Just on a question of timing, does the Minister intend to wait until the EU process of reform is some further way down the line before a bill is introduced here, or does she intend to proceed before we know what the outcome of that European process will be?
We hope to introduce the Procurement Reform Bill before the summer recess. Obviously, we require to give ourselves comfort that what we are proposing in that bill is going to be within the confines of the revised European Directive. But I want to be in a position where that bill will be introduced to Parliament for parliamentary consideration before the summer recess. And obviously, I'll keep Parliament updated on that timescale. As I was going on to say, Presiding Officer, in taking forward our own reforms, I think it's vitally important that we are both aware of and that we very frankly recognise the tension that will inevitably be at the heart of any approach to procurement. On the one hand, We want the system to help our businesses grow and become more competitive. On the other hand, we can't afford to ignore opportunities to save money, so we always have to strive to strike the right balance and indeed align as far as we can these two objectives. And that's what we are seeking to do in our approach to procurement reform. A central element of that programme is the proposed procurement reform bill. Consultation closed late last year. We've had 250 or more, in fact, responses from a wide range of interests. The analysis was published earlier this year, and the findings are helping inform the final policy content of the bill. The bill, I hope, will help us accelerate improvements in the system and ensure that, especially on major contracts, we extract additional value, whether that's economic, social or environmental value, from our spending. It will also help to tackle unnecessary inconsistencies for suppliers and help ensure that doing business with the public sector is simpler, more transparent and more accessible to suppliers, especially for SMEs. And while EU law doesn't allow us to discriminate in favour of indigenous businesses, nevertheless, removing the barriers to SME participation in procurement markets can and will contribute to our economic performance. We don't want to add unnecessary costs or risks, but used appropriately, social and environmental contract clauses can deliver good results and they can add significant value for communities. And using the bill to promote standardisation and improved procurement procedures will improve value for money and reduce costs. Nowhere, Presiding Officer, is that more important than in the construction sector, which is facing particular challenges. Last October, we launched a fundamental review of construction procurement led by Robin Crawford and Ken Lewandowski. We want to see the sort of improvements delivered for goods and services procurement over recent years replicated for construction, and I know that the industry is desperate to see improvements as well. The review is making good progress, and indeed today I can announce that following an early recommendation from Robin and Ken, the Government is seeking partners to trial the use of project bank accounts, and we will publish guidance promoting their adoption on major infrastructure projects. Project bank accounts will help to ensure that companies right down the supply chain are paid promptly and that larger companies higher up the chain aren't able to withhold payments where work has been performed. I think that's a good start to the review, and I look forward to receiving the report later in the summer and implementing its recommendations. One of businesses' main complaints is obviously about pre-qualification procedures. Time and again we hear complaints about entry thresholds being used in PQQs in a way that excludes capable smaller local businesses. So I'm pleased that the e-tendering software PCS Tender now contains a suite of standard questions that have been developed by a working group. These tools will only be effective, though, if they are actually used, and the bill will help us promote standardisation and good practice by making it a requirement that the standard questions are adopted. These and other improvements to PCS are designed to deliver a less complex process, reduce inconsistency and increase transparency. The opening up of subcontracting opportunities in PCS has also helped SMEs to access and bid for major infrastructure projects and indeed for events like next year's Ryder Cup. We're also seeing a rapid increase in the use of quick quote as a means of delivering low-value procurements, which also facilitates better engagement with local suppliers. Obviously, we need the system to work for jobs too, and that's why a major priority for the bill will be accelerating and promoting the use of community benefit clauses in major contracts. I mentioned supported businesses at the outset of my remarks, and I think this is an important issue here as well. We know how difficult recent times have been for our supported businesses with changes in funding for Remploy. That's why the National Framework for Supported Businesses that was announced last year is so important, and it has the full support of Government. Last but not least, Presiding Officer, I just want to make the point that we also need to expect companies who bid for public contracts to demonstrate high standards of ethical conduct or know that they risk being excluded from the market. The practice of blacklisting, failure to comply with tax obligations, other acts of professional misconduct may and should in future result in a company being judged as unsuitable to bid. On blacklisting, the Government regards this practice as wholly unacceptable, and my officials have invited trade union representatives, including the STUC, to work with us to develop guidelines for purchasers on how to address this issue when awarding contracts. And while EU law suggests we can't make it a specific legal requirement that companies pay their staff the living wage, we are actively looking at ways in which we can further promote and encourage them to do so as a matter of good and, indeed, expected business practice. So, Presiding Officer, as I said in my introduction, we can be proud of progress, but there is much more to do, and I look forward to hearing members' contributions during the debate.
Many, many thanks. I now call on Dr Elaine Murray. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I suspected that maybe procurement as a topic for debate may not have set many members' pulses racing, although I'm quite encouraged to hear that the debate is actually tightly subscribed. As others have said, the previous two speakers have said, the public procurement in Scotland is extremely important, £9 billion annually, but half of that from our local authorities. And how that significant financial resource is distributed, which businesses benefit from that expenditure, and the conditions attached to the awarding of successful contracts are indeed of great importance to the national economy and to local economies, of course, but also to ensuring that the small and medium-sized enterprises and social enterprises are able to access public sector contracts and to the provision, of course, of social and environmental benefits. This debate, coming in advance of the forthcoming bill, gives members the opportunity to contribute their views regarding what the bill should contain. It also gives us, I think, the opportunity to discuss what can be improved, and the Cabinet Secretary has already spoken about improvements to procurement which have happened without legislation, because legislation is not necessary for all the improvements. And indeed, some respondents to the Government's pre-legislative consultation did express the view that they didn't think the legislation was really necessary. That view was also voiced by some of the participants in the David Hume Institute's seminar on this topic on the 29th of January. And these participants argued that what is required is actually changing the attitudes and approach to public procurement rather than changing the legislation which governs it. The arguments surrounding this viewpoint will doubtless form part of the evidence that the committee will take on the bill. But I think that the discussion will centre actually on that sensitive balance about what may be done and what actually should be required to be done. The bill's progress is slower than originally expected. I listened with interest to the Cabinet Secretary's response to Patrick Harvey, and I appreciate that the Government are awaiting detail of the new EU directive in order to ensure compliance. The Cabinet Secretary in her speech mentioned supported businesses, and in that context I would like to highlight the concerns raised with members over the new Article 17, which will replace Article 19 in the EU directive and is due, I think, to go to plenary in the European Parliament this week. This was the subject of an email from Councillor Paul Carey of Glasgow City Council, who raised concerns that the protection currently offered to supported factories and businesses such as Blindcraft is being downgraded by the reduction of the threshold of disabled employees from 50% to 30% and the extension of the definition to include disadvantaged people. I started by commenting that members might not have been excited by the selection of this topic for debate, but judging by the number of briefings we have received, many stakeholders do indeed recognise its importance. Some are disappointed by what appears to be a shift in emphasis in the proposed bill from sustainable procurement to simply procurement reform. They are concerned that this signals a move away from the social and environmental benefits which good procurement practice can achieve to a more technical reform of the system, beneficial to business, hopefully to smaller businesses and social enterprises, but missing the more widespread and ethical benefits which a more encompassing bill could provide. Many stakeholders, including the Federation of Small Businesses, SCEAF and the SCVO, have reflected on the effect of the current focus of achieving cost savings, rather than taking a more holistic view of the overall benefit of the spend to local economies and the maximisation of social benefit. Jim and Margaret Cuthbert's report, Using Our Buying Power to Benefit Scotland, illustrated how procurement practice can work against the economic and social development and can lock out Scottish companies, particularly smaller companies, out of the public sector contracts for a period of years. And I appreciate that report was published some time ago, but I think we do also need to consider carefully some of the points which they made in that piece of research. And I listened, of course, to the statistics quoted by Gordon MacDonald and the Cabinet Secretary regarding the access for small and medium-sized enterprises. Some of that is around the definition of what is a small and medium-sized enterprise. And I think the definition of an enterprise of less than 250 employees is pretty big. There's not many enterprises that size in my own constituency. It actually encompasses something like 90% of Scottish businesses. So I'm not sure it's quite the success it's claimed to be. The FSB report, Local Procurement, Making the Most of Small Businesses, tells us that 70% 40% of SMEs across the UK don't actually even bid for public sector contracts, being deterred by onerous, time-consuming pre-qualification questionnaires, and I appreciate the Government is looking at that. The relatively high cost of submitting a bid compared to the value of the contract, the aggregation of contracts and joint procuring, putting contracts beyond the reach of small businesses, and also the long-term frameworks for major construction contracts. Some of these deterrents could be removed without additional legislation. Both reports contain illustrations of how procurement in other EU countries is managed differently. The problems encountered by small businesses in Scotland and the rest of the UK is not due, as is often said, solely to EU directives. But the bill does present an opportunity to define what we expect to be delivered in return for the £9 billion of public sector spend, and not only in terms of the goods and services it purchases. This level of spend should be a powerful lever to promote good practice across a whole range of behaviours. We should expect those businesses which receive public money, for example, to pay their taxes. Companies which conceal their wealth in tax havens whilst exploiting some of the poorest countries in the world should not be awarded contracts through the tax-paying public in Scotland. The public sector should be paying its workers a living wage, but should also be persuading contractors to do the same. We should not be subsidising. No, I got 10 seconds, sorry. We should not be subsidising low pay in other sectors. And I know my colleague Kezia Dugdale is considering a bill, taking forward John Park's bill on that.
Must close, please.
Workers' rights also need to be respected, and the Cabinet Secretary made good points about the use of community benefit clauses. And I'm looking forward to the introduction of the bill and its passage through Parliament.
Well done. Thanks very much. Now calling Mary Scanlon. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and we also welcome this debate today and the opportunity to bring forward some ideas. The motion in the name of Maureen Watt states, welcomes members' views on the efficacy of current public procurement processes and on the scope and potential for improvements to be made to these processes. So I would say, and you may expect me to say as Deputy Convener of the Audit Committee, that a very good place to start in response to the scope and potential for improvements would be the Audit Scotland and the Accounts Commission reports. Too often recommendations for improvement in procurement are highlighted, then ignored or partially implemented, only to be erased again in the reports that we receive years later. Before Bob Black, the previous Auditor-General, retired, he presented a report entitled Commissioning Social Care, and he expressed his concerns as follows, and I state, current ways of delivering services are unlikely to be sustainable. To be frank, my particular concern, which is shared by my colleagues, is that this is the latest of 6 reports that Audit Scotland has prepared in this general area since devolution, and they have all contained challenging findings about commissioning, procurement and the delivery of social and healthcare services and the efficiency of partnership working. So I would think, given the demographic challenges faced, this is surely a sector where effective procurement to provide quality services and value for money is critical. More recently, quickly.
John Mason.
I thank the member for giving way. I mean, she mentions limited resources. Now, I wonder if she would accept that one of the reasons we have limited resources is because we have tied up funds in PFI projects which have ended up being far too expensive for what we get.
Scanlon.
Well, I'm not sure that that was actually a positive contribution to the debate, which I am actually hoping to give. But more recently, we received a report on improving community planning, which states that 10 years after community planning was given a statutory basis, the partnerships are not yet able to show they've had a significant impact in delivering improved outcomes. But the whole ethos of community planning partnerships, which we all supported, was to ensure that representatives across communities would sit round the table, bring the needs, concerns and a better understanding of that community to the table, and to ensure that decisions made, and hopefully procurement decisions, would be beneficial to the local community. I thought Gordon MacDonald highlighted that point very well in his contribution. But probably the main procurement issue in recent times was the report on managing ICT contracts. The Auditor-General had serious concerns over the procurement of ICT in the public sector, but focused only on 3 organisations, including the Registers of Scotland. The Registers of Scotland had spent £112 million at the time of the report against an original cost of £66 million. 2 projects were cancelled with a £6.7 million write-off, and to quote from the report, individual projects lack detailed cost, benefits and milestones, and contributed to a lack of ownership for cost and time overrun. So plenty of scope there for improvements in procurement as outlined in the report. And the report also states that the Scottish Government provided limited support to these organisations, and I think that's perhaps something the Cabinet Secretary could also look at. But I hope the Public Procurement Bill will make it easier, as others have said, for new businesses, SMEs, third sector and social enterprises to access public contract opportunities and subcontract. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned the construction industry, and Michael Levack recently highlighted, and I quote again, there is currently too little direct linkage between the awards of contracts and the creation of more employment and training opportunities with construction companies with a strong local presence and pedigree, and I acknowledge the points the Cabinet Secretary made on that point. I also found the report by Campbell Christie that he did a few years ago very interesting in terms of procurement and commissioning. And again, he quotes, there is a widespread belief that the Scottish Government and local authorities are less diligent about scrutinising and costing in-house services than those contracted out to external providers. Now, whether or not this is the case, I'm sure that more transparency, which I appreciate is being included in the bill, I'm sure that more transparency about this process would be widely welcomed. Campbell Christie goes on to say there is still much to be done to ensure that when competition takes place between the public and private sector, it is on an equal footing. And I would hope that we examine the quality of services, the effectiveness and reliability of services, as well as the value for money, and give the public, private and third sector the same opportunities. He also highlights, and I totally agree with this, that the focus in social care and support, they are still commissioned and funded on the basis of units of cost and volume, with very little attention paid to the value of those services in terms of outcomes identified by the individual service user and families, or by the community planning partnerships in single outcome agreements. I appreciate I'm running out of time, Presiding Officer, so I'll just finish there.
Many thanks. Much appreciated. And we now move to open debates. Colin Chick-Brodie to be followed by Margaret McCulloch. Up to 6 minutes, please, including interventions.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to speak in this debate today, and I do so on the back of foundations set out in the report to which Mary Scanlon applied, the Christie Commission report. The drivers in that report were clear. Firstly, reforms must aim to empower communities and individuals receiving public services to be involved in the design and delivery of those very services. Secondly, public service providers and demanders have to work to integrate service provision. And thirdly and lastly, our whole system of public services, public, third and private sectors, must become more efficient by reducing duplication and sharing services. Simply, Presiding Officer, we have to demolish the current shibboleths of public service procurement and establish the rebuilding of sustainable economic growth built upon a profoundly new buying culture. Gone has to be the culture of we have always done it this way, or we always contract with Joe Blow because he knows us and he's never let us down. Where, I ask you, is the best value or client benefit in those statements? Last Friday, I had the delight to meet with one of our more progressive councils, which was actively talking as to how they would build further service provision and the buying of services around its communities, of how it would seek to engage the local third sector and social enterprises in the provision of public services, reviewing, re-engineering and recognising that there is a social cost element attached to outsourcing work to commercial companies, and just because they've always done it, but which companies then are well out with the local or neighbouring authority boundaries, thus impacting the social costs to that very community, and they dare to suggest impacting its income by not seriously looking at the effectivity and efficiency of capable social and third sector enterprises much closer to home. Presiding Officer, while I'm at it, I hope the bill will place strictures on local authorities which allow commercial companies to retain rightly profits from their contracts, yet the same authorities insist on clawing back in some cases, profits from the social enterprise and third sector companies which provide services, and this applies particularly in the care sector. This is not about protectionism, it's about productivity and social involvement. I also ask the Government, through the course of the bill, to secure at the point of inquiry a better and easier standardisation of contracts. Whether we agree with 32 councils or not, it is administrative silliness to have simple and easy standard contracts redrawn and regurgitated across all 32 councils in the country. And I'm glad, Presiding Officer, the Cabinet Secretary alluded to the living wage. In the consultation analysis summary of the proposed bill, in the annex on the living wage, it said procurement activities should be used to encourage contractors to pay the living wage to their employees engaged in the delivery of public sector contracts. Yes.
I agree that there should be an encouragement, but currently EU legislation and a test case, Rüffert versus Nieder's action, shows that we cannot put living wage into contracts and specify that that must be done. Would it not be best if we were at the top table in Europe to try and change that legislation?
I thank Mr Stewart for his intervention. Of course, I agree with the latter point, and I will come to the former point in a minute. Presiding Officer, on that point of the living wage in public sector contracts, it is anathema to me that we employ a company, and some of them in this very establishment, a company whose revenues are over £2 billion in revenues, which has grown over the last 5 years by 42%, whose profit after tax has risen 52% over the same period, and whose dividend per share has risen by 60% over that same period of time. Yet it still refuses to pay the local public sector employees a living wage. And coming to Mr Stewart's point, while European law suggests we can't force that condition and can only encourage it, I am legally advised, and this actually happened in some PFI contracts, that we can and we should feature the living wage requirements on new contracts. So why are we, a significant paying client, allowing this public payment social policy and madness? The proposed procurement bill affords us, Presiding Officer, with many opportunities. Sustained growth through greater local participation with the third sector. A reduction in the social costs of related work. A reduction, indeed, in the costs of climatic change through reduced transport needs. Productivity increases through a cohesive team effort and a community empowerment effort. An encouragement also, I believe, of the young to get involved in developing the work skills to improve their community, and above all, a restriction to all existing public service purveyors, and the message that the world is changing, the culture and the buying behavioural practice is and has to change, and it has to be more creative and innovative. On that basis, Presiding Officer, I believe the proposed procurement bill will deliver much more than just better value and lower cost.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Keeping to time. Margaret McCulloch, to be followed by Linda Fabiani. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Let me begin by welcoming this opportunity to debate the proposed procurement reform bill, as well as the wider procurement agenda, which I'm glad to see has at last been given the prominence in this Parliament that it deserves. As indicated, annual spending through public procurement stands at £9.2 billion, rising to £11 billion. How we spend that money through public contracts and how those contracts are shaped has a direct impact on the economy. And so a new bill tied to a wider series of reforms gives us in this Parliament the chance to make a real difference. We have the chance to follow the lead of Labour-led South Lanarkshire Council and others in challenging the injustice of blacklisting. We have the chance to promote decent wages, sustainable growth and a living wage. And we have the chance to make the procurement framework in this country more business-friendly and socially responsible.
It's that last point I want to flesh out in my speech today, because I agree with all those who replied to the Scottish Government's consultation and says that public procurement can be an economic lever and a driver of real change. So I am arguing today for a responsible, pro-growth public procurement framework, one which supports employment, helps our recovery and is fair for Scotland's workers and Scotland's small businesses. The Scottish Chamber of Commerce, in their response to the Government's consultation, were clear that with a stagnant economy, the importance of public sector contracts to Scottish businesses cannot be underestimated. And that's why public procurement has to be sensitive to the immediate needs of Scottish firms, as well as the wide driver to build a stronger, more responsible, sustainable economy. It may not be entirely evident from the Government's analysis of their own consultation, but there is a consensus about what is wrong with public procurement, uniting a whole range of respondents from left to right. The most significant contracts are bundled into orders so large that Scottish-based SMEs cannot possibly tender for them and have to subcontract. Big firms can win big contracts, cream off the best bits and leave small businesses with scraps. Our interpretation of EU rules is too narrow and our adherence to that interpretation is too strict. The public sector is being de-skilled and hollowed out of specialists who actually understand complex contracts. If the bill doesn't address those points comprehensively, then it will not simply have failed to match the Government's rhetoric, it will have failed to meet the needs of the economy. By procuring better, we can support Scottish firms, but where there are major contracts in which a significant amount of public money has been invested, we should go further. The £11 billion we spend through procurement each year is about more than a simple transaction. It's public money that could and should deliver some of the wider benefits to Scotland. This bill should therefore do more than require those in the receipt of major contracts to publish training and apprenticeship plans or consider what they be achieved through community benefit clauses. This bill should set out clearly how firms in receipt of major government contracts can bring jobs, training and apprenticeships into communities, backed up by achievable targets and statutory requirements. And, Presiding Officer, we should have a clear system for monitoring progress against those requirements so that suppliers know there are consequences if they do not fulfil their community benefit clauses. Before concluding, let me deal with contracts in more detail, because while there is more the Government can do with the new bill, they can do a lot within the existing rules. The public sector is committed to being a good customer which pays its invoices in time. Perhaps it could do better. But contractors also have responsibilities. The construction sector tells us that late payments can be crippling. The Government's biggest contractors can expect payment within 28 days, but subcontractors can be waiting up to 90 days for the money to work its way down to them. So that's why I was here to pleased to hear the Minister mention the project bank account. The Government should also look at whether awarding contracts annually is always best. Forward planning is critical to the viability of small businesses, training providers and the third sector, who have all kinds of costs from staffing, property leases to equipment, and we need to take into account their difficulties. Presiding Officer, this bill and the procurement reform agenda isn't just about businesses in Scotland, it's about how we do business in Scotland. I would hope that with some listening and some dialogue, and with a bit more ambition, that the Scottish Government could move us towards a more business-friendly and responsible public procurement framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Now call on Linda Fabiani to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd also like to thank the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee for holding this debate. I think it's an excellent idea to ask for members' views, as they say, on the efficacy of current public procurement processes and the scope and potential for improvements. Because it is a very important issue which warrants much consultation and discussion. I'd suggest that the number of submissions which have been forwarded to MSP since the debate was publicised backs that up. as does the level of discussion across the board whenever the subject is raised. I don't believe, though, that this expected one bill can be, or indeed should be, a panacea for all procurement ills. It can provide a framework, though, and can send very, very strong messages, coupled with sensible, innovative and ambitious guidance to those who operate procurement processes. As I have said before in this chamber, I served as a member of the Royal Incorporation of Architects in Scotland's President's Commission on Building a Better Scotland, and again I declare my interest in this subject as an honorary fellow of RIAS. The President's Commission focused, of course, on the construction industry, and particular findings very much reflect the need that I touched on above to ensure clarity and a degree of uniformity in procurement processes, particularly for services. Many processes are too time-consuming and costly relative to the project scale. And in relation to that, I think localism is something that we've talked about very, very many times, and very much about, keeping work in Scotland where possible. But I would also say that, we do sometimes find cases where the costs for the portal are very, very low, and common sense would perhaps suggest that we can even bring that down further to community level when we're looking for those procurement projects. Because, in East Kilbride, for example, my constituency, we have many, many companies which could benefit, as could the overall economy, from the ability to be truly local. It's, I think, quite opposite. We're talking about the construction industry, and there they are drilling away out. So it's nice to see there's work going on out there. And, of course, it's the application of regulations rather than the regulations themselves which can be the problem. The pre-qualification questionnaire, for example, sometimes a degree of being completely over the top in relation to questions. I would ask, for example, if something is already the law, can there be a presumption of compliance rather than this constant having to restate things? I think we also have a risk-averse culture, and my colleague Chick Brodie referred to that, I believe. Or maybe it's actually covering one's back would be a more honest way of putting it, in the blame culture that we have. So I think there is that approach, and a misunderstanding of the regulations, which, with on occasion, procurement being run by those who do not fully understand what is required. I would thank the Deputy First Minister for meeting with myself and RIAS recently to discuss some of these issues. And RIAS, of course, is a member organisation, the members being the architectural profession, a profession which has been hard hit by the economic downturn, but also which, to my frustration over many years, has not been granted the respect which it is due for the contribution it makes to our environment, our economy and, of course, our sense of well-being. This is manifested often by the public procurement process. Over the years, I would say over the last 20 to 25 years particularly, a move away from the traditional appointment of architects as heads of design team to design and build initiatives, for example, large companies being in the driving seat with the potential to drive down quality in the name of cost and return to shareholders. And very often you get the position where the architect hasn't even met with the client. I find that a very bizarre state of affairs when something's being commissioned. And I'm absolutely not convinced this is always the best value. I've said too here before that research has shown that in the construction industry there can be 50 to 60 bidders for a project. Again, what a waste of money overall for people. Then, of course, there is the competition form of design procurement. I would say the most notorious example of that recently was the debacle of Glasgow City Council's George Square project. Respected architectural professionals such as David Mackey and Andy McMillan on the judging panel, and respected practices working up designs for submission, only for the competition to be abandoned.
Final minute.
Seems to me a ridiculous state of affairs and waste of time and public money, as well as a waste of time for all these practices that work so hard. So not only do we have bad procurement, we have bad pre-procurement. And this treatment to a profession which, in the words of Colin Donald in the business section of the Sunday Herald recently, said had the potential to lift public spirits while promoting economic growth, and was an area where Scotland has shown unique world-class quality over the centuries. We should celebrate that more. We should look at our procurement processes in the round about how we procure all forms of services for the public. And again, I would like to thank Maureen Watt and her committee for giving me the opportunity to put these points forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Just before I call John Mason, can I say that the building work is not supposed to be taking place while Parliament is sitting, and we're having that matter investigated. John Mason, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, for your reassurance as well. Very much welcome the fact that procurement is on the agenda, and while I think we're all accepting there's definitely room for improvement, I think we can also accept that there has been progress over recent years. For example, increasing the contracts won by small businesses, with 82% of winning businesses were SMEs, and 68%, which is up 12% from 2010, were Scottish SMEs. I take Elaine Murray's point that the definition of an SME can be quite wide, and I think that's correct, and sometimes there's very small micro businesses that we need to be helping more as well. By contrast, the UK has not been doing so well and lags behind the Netherlands, Germany and France in terms of procurement from the SME sector. And once again, I think we do see that the UK has proved that it is being less than successful. Of course, as already mentioned, the European Union is a factor in all this, and we can expect some of the anti-Europe brigade to start complaining. But let's remember that the EU aims for a level playing field, and as a small country like Scotland, we stand to gain more than we lose by our companies exporting more and working more overseas. Again, as already mentioned, Jim and Margaret Cuthbert came to the Finance Committee and were talking about how other countries are often better at breaking down contracts into smaller, more manageable sizes for social enterprises and SMEs. So maybe there is scope from learning from some of our EU friends. I have to say, I do think the concept of best value is good, and I suspect others are going to talk about that this afternoon. But best value, in my experience, meant that we were allowed to look at more considerations than just the price, compared to the previous way where often it was just the price we were looking at. Now, I do know Oxfam's and SCVO's reservations about this, that there may be a tendency to slip back to only looking at the price. But I do not think that is a fair definition of best value, and that's not what best value is meant to be doing. And as a councillor in Glasgow City Council, I did see on a number of occasions an award was made which was not the lowest price. Then we as opposition members would often question that and say why not, and then there was often a good explanation as to why we really wanted the quality, and the quality outweighed any saving, and I think that's absolutely right in my opinion. I do think Oxfam are perhaps slightly naive, as if they could think we could forget about money and price altogether, and somewhere we need to get a balance in all of this. I think SCVO is right to say that £9 billion is not just a honeypot for business. If a construction company building for the public sector is different from a construction company building for Morrisons or Tesco or any other supermarket, we should expect higher standards in all sorts of ways, and a benefit to the wider community, especially the local community. But of course, we also don't want to chase these organisations away. And again, as a councillor in Glasgow, I remember seeing that Glasgow was competing with Lanarkshire in many cases, and if we had too many onerous conditions in the city, then business would go to another local authority. So, as the Cabinet Secretary has already mentioned in her speech, balance is needed in a lot of this. It must be advantageous to do business in Scotland, but I think sometimes when we look at the balance at the moment, we feel that perhaps there's too much benefit to the private sector and not enough to the community. I do think we had a very good briefing from SCIAF. They quote from the Scottish Government's 2009 Sustainable Procurement Action Plan, which says procurement as a process whereby organisations meet their needs for goods, services, works and utilities in a way that achieves value for money on a whole-life basis and generates benefits not only to the organisation but also to society, the economy and the environment. And they also make the point that ethically traded goods and services need not cost more and may in fact provide better value for money. SCIAF referred to the 2012 European Union Court of Justice confirmation that fair trade criteria can be used in public procurement requests as long as it is the criteria underlying the label and not the label itself which is being used. It does strike me there is something fundamentally wrong that we enforce a minimum wage on producers in this country, but not on imports from elsewhere. That is not to say a minimum wage level should be the same in every country around the world, but it should be appropriate for costs in that particular country, and that is fundamentally what fair trade is all about. Oxfam also referred to inequality both within Scotland, the UK and overseas, and the socio-economic duty, which of course is one of the characteristics of the Equality Act 2010. Finally, I'd just like to mention one or two examples where I think there is room for improvement. A little two-person business in my constituency who were making rubber stamps, that's the kind that you used to use on paper, and I think are still actually quite widely used, and they were losing out on their contract or their supply with the local school because of the big national contract coming in. Another local business which wrote to me, I was visiting them, and just briefly they said, "We carry out work on a regular basis with the NHS, Scottish Prison Service, Clydesdale Bank, Mecca Bingo, to name but a few, but we don't get an opportunity to cost any contracts whatsoever with Glasgow City Council. We have tried tirelessly to get on their supplier list with no success and no feedback as to why we have been unsuccessful." Again, with advice services the other year, we had the CAB and others competing in the East End of Glasgow, well, throughout Glasgow, which was a big mistake. And a final example would just be the fact that here at Holyrood, as Patrick Harvey has raised in the past, we are drinking foreign wine when we could be drinking Scottish beer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are very tight for time. Tavish Scott to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I too declare an interest as an honorary fellow of RIAS and very much share Linda Fabiani's point that this bill, the Deputy First Minister's bill, cannot be and should not be seen as a panacea for all the challenges of a procurement system here in Scotland. No piece of legislation could do that. But let me rise to the challenge that I think the Deputy Convener of the committee raised in his opening remarks about seeking to offer some thoughts about areas that the Deputy First Minister may wish to consider in her bill, and indeed that whether these are in the bill or whether these are just in the form of government procurement actions. As she knows, the government and Shetland Lands Council have recently commissioned through North Hubco a new Anson High School in Lerwick, which is a very welcome project, and I thank her for the answer she gave me some weeks ago at question time on this. But it did raise with me some fundamental questions about the process of procurement that's now undertaken by these enormous procurement systems in different parts of Scotland. Now, in the north, which covers rather my constituency, Miller Construction Services, one of the UK's largest building companies, is the organisation who are part of that North Hubco. Indeed, they've got 3 representatives, 3 directors on the board of that. Now, we still don't know, and I'm sure, and nor do I expect the Deputy First Minister to answer these questions today, that would be quite unrealistic and unfair, but we still don't know in the tendering process for that new school, whether any other company was allowed to tender. We don't know what the price was for that school, or indeed the other 5 schools that were procured at the same time as part of the same contract. And we don't know also whether a number of other small businesses had an opportunity to provide a price and therefore help the value for money argument that the Deputy First Minister and other members have very rightly made in this debate. And I hope therefore that in testing the current systems, never mind introducing new ones, but in testing the current systems, that the Government will give some thought to just ensuring that there is transparency in the process that they currently operate through their Hubco setup right across Scotland. I ask no more that firms should have the chance to price for work. And on the particular point that many members have made, which I heartily agree with, on small businesses getting the chance, just getting merely the chance to tender for work, never mind actually winning it, but just getting the chance to tender for it, it's worth pointing out on North Hubco again that the surveyors and indeed the architects, in terms of the architecture, it's a Newcastle-based company called Ryder Architecture, if that works. So again, I do not know if Scottish firms, whether Aberdeen firms or a consortia of Scottish architectural businesses, had an opportunity to win that work or to indeed even be on the first list. But it strikes me that these are areas where, again, the transparency of the process would be welcome. And if there's a principle that I would and hope to commend to the Deputy First Minister in her consideration of her bill, then it strikes me that that would be an important one. Eileen Murray very rightly raised quite a number of submissions that we have been given for this debate, and it does seem to me that some important points were made in that, not least of which by the Scottish Building Federation in their briefing for this debate, when they pointed out that only 1 in 6 small firms that they defined as with a turnover below £500,000 a year, typically employing less than 10 people, not the 250 people that Eileen Murray rightly drew attention to earlier on, had participated in a public tender over the preceding year. Only 1 in 6 involved in a public tender in the preceding year, and overall almost 2/3 of small construction firms say they have opted out of public procurement entirely over the past 3 years because the costs are prohibitively high. Now, that seems to me to strike a chime with the remarks that the Deputy First Minister and other members made about the need to come at this from a new angle. Indeed, Chick Brodie made that point as well, and I had some sympathy with his observations about a new approach. But it also seems to me that when the Federation of Small Business for Scotland describe in their briefing that the overall value of work going to small firms has remained fairly constant for the past 6 years. That's their figures, not mine. Over the last 6 years, the overall value of work has remained constant. There does seem to me considerable room for improvement and considerable scope for the government to come forward with some new measures. Now, I should say, and I think it's important to recognise this, that where the government have changed, for example, towards a single standard PQQ, I think that's a very important and positive step forward. But there are many other areas that could come forward, whether it's in the procurement bill or in others, that would be very welcome indeed from a small business perspective. We talk the talk on small businesses, but I do think this bill and other government activities would allow Parliament and indeed the government of the day to walk the walk as well, and there are areas there that could be carried out. I also do not think we should forget the traditional forms of procurement. Dunfermline High School, as Rias were pointing out, is a beautiful new school. It's airy, it's light, it does all the things that I'm told the head teacher there described his success as achieving 98% of what he wanted in the design of that particular building. So very good things can be done by traditional forms of procurement as well, and that seems to me is an important component in the overall argument about value for money and how that is taken forward. But in welcoming the point of this debate and welcoming the fact the committee is doing a lot of detailed work in this area, led by Maureen Watt, I just want to make sure that we just don't call this the be-all and end-all, but instead the government bring forward other initiatives which can very much further this work.
Thank you very much. I call Kevin Stewart to be followed by Anne McTaggart.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee for giving us this opportunity to debate this important issue today. For many, this issue is not particularly sexy. I have to say that I'm an anorak when it comes to procurement, and looking at the submissions that we've had from out with this place, I think there are many other folks who are taking a keen interest in what we are about to embark on here in regards to the new procurement bill. An anorak. Where do I begin? In my previous life as a councillor, I was often told that we couldn't do certain things because of EU procurement rules. That got to me so much that I actually decided that I was going to go on a certain amount of training to see if there really were those barriers that everybody says that there were. And even beyond that, I actually had the council's procurement system, PCOS, put in my own computer in my own office so I could track what was going on. And I know that that is anorakishness beyond, but I think it was very important because a lot of the barriers that were said to be there were not there at all. And it was down to custom and practice and risk aversity that some folk took the view that they did. And I think that we need to challenge some of the custom and practice that is going on out there at this moment in time. And beyond that, we have got to actually ensure that folks know what best value and value for money actually is. James Thompson of Scott Moncrieff, giving evidence to the Local Government Committee on the 27th of March this year, said, on best value principles, there has been confusion in some of the responses from others. It is not about just going for the lowest cost option. It is about having regard to economy cost option. It is about regard to economy, efficiency and effectiveness, and delivering continuous improvement in sustainable services. And I agree with his definition there. And in the Scottish Government's Community Benefits and Public Procurement Guidance Note on page 3, it says the priority for all public procurement is to achieve value for money. Value for money does not, however, mean lowest price. It is defined in the Scottish Public Finance Manual as the optimum combination of whole life cost and quality to meet the end user's requirement. And whole life cost and the requirement of the end user makes me think of the story about Grandma's 50-year-old broom. It's done a huge amount of work over that 50-year course of life, and it's only had 9 new handles and 11 new brush heads. Now, these are the kind of things that we have got to think of when we are making major decisions round about procurement. I do not think that this bill will be the panacea, as Linda Fabiani and Tavish Scott have said. And I think that one of the things which we have got to deal with here, with this situation, and with other forthcoming bills where procurement will play a major role, bills such as the Community Renewal and Empowerment Bill and the Health and Social Care Integration Bill, where procurement will be at the forefront. We need to look very carefully at what we are doing in that regard when it comes to this. I think that a huge amount of the difficulties that we have is because of a lack of common sense. A severe lack of common sense in some cases. The Local Government Committee visited Ayr on Monday to hear the views of folks from Ayrshire and Dumfries and Galloway. And a huge amount of community reps gave their views in the community engagement session, and beyond that we had folk given formal evidence in a session in the afternoon. But some of the conversations that are had, the best ones are also always at the breaks and at the lunch times. And we have got, in that community and right across the country, a huge amount of community organisations that are doing everything possible to better the lives of the folks that they live alongside. And impediments, bureaucracies that have been put in place by local authorities, health boards and others, are actually impeding the small-scale procurement that they are doing. And I give an example, Presiding Officer, and I know I've only got a minute left to give that example, where a guy was talking about his community group wanting a new wheelbarrow, right? And they had to go round the houses to buy a new wheelbarrow. 3 written quotes, and had to be then given to the council, and then the council decided which one they could actually get, when this guy had the gumption, the common sense to realise what the wheelbarrow requirement was, and thought he could get it for the lowest cost. You know, this kind of nonsense has got to be dealt with. And while I welcome the bill, I don't think it's a panacea, and what I would call for out there is some degree of gumption.
Thank you very much. Anne McTaggart, to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. In these tough economic circumstances, it is right that this Parliament takes time to scrutinise the way that Scotland uses its buying power to promote social and economic development. Our public sector spends more than £9 billion every year on procurement, and it is increasingly important that this money is used to benefit those communities hardest hit by rising levels of unemployment. The way that the Scottish Government acquires goods and services impacts significantly on small and medium-sized businesses and can act to support those enterprises worst affected by continuing financial pressures. In turn, these businesses play a vital role in sustaining communities and providing employment for workers.
The criteria by which we award public sector contracts dictate the emphasis that companies place on the working conditions of their employees and the commitment they make to investing in Scottish communities. It is profoundly short-sighted of any government to award contracts on the sole basis of the lowest tender, and this approach fails to recognise the long-term consequences of driving down wages and sending jobs abroad. I accept there must be a balance between the pursuit of wider social aims and value for money for the taxpayer. However, I do not believe these two aspirations are incompatible. If the Scottish Government were to better prioritise working conditions of staff as a key criteria in the procurement process, entire communities would be better off as a result. Though the Scottish Government have ruled out supporting legislation for a living wage, this would have made it easier to avoid those situations where the working conditions of employees are compromised in order to achieve the most competitive tender. Certainly. Cabinet Secretary. Can I have the Cabinet Secretary's microphone?
In the interest of fairness, I wonder if the member would acknowledge that it's not that we don't support legislation to support a living wage, it's that EU legislation doesn't allow it, but that we have said we are committed to finding every possible way to encourage and promote the paying of a living wage as best practice by all companies.
Anne McTaggart.
Thank you. The Jimmy Reid Foundation report on procurement and its Scottish public sector identified that the Scottish Government often locks Scottish companies out from being able to bid for public sector contracts. Often these contracts are so large and incorporate so many distinct elements that many small and medium-sized businesses are unable to compete. This results in contracts being awarded to huge multinational companies and investments being taken out of Scotland that could have been supporting local industry and small businesses. The Scottish Government Procurement Bill offers this Parliament an opportunity to change this unsustainable practice and to stand up for those businesses that until now have been unable to bid for lucrative public sector contracts. Our Government should seek to invest in those communities that stand to benefit from providing goods and services to public bodies and can grow their businesses to employ greater numbers of workers in Scotland. This would provide the dual benefit of investing directly in Scottish communities and tackling the problems of unemployment and slow economic growth across the country. Presiding Officer, furthermore, our procurement process should in future seek to exclude those companies who have sought to evade their responsibility as employers and those who have acted illegally to conspire against employees active in the trade unions. And I welcome some of our trade union members in the gallery today, and I also welcome the Deputy First Minister's commitment to look at this issue. As the blacklisting of workers in the construction sector should serve as an example of private sector employees who are unfit to be awarded public sector contracts. And I believe that this should form part of the criteria contained within the tendering process. Those companies who took part in this disgraceful practice should not be able to bid for public sector contracts, and the right of employees to be active in trade unions should never be compromised by private businesses, particularly those who act on behalf of local authorities and national government.
Final minute.
I encourage the Scottish Government to review the current parts of the system of the procurement in Scotland which are failing enterprises, failing communities, failing trade unions and failing the taxpayer. I urge the Cabinet Secretary to ensure that the Procurement Bill better addresses the concerns of the Scottish businesses and makes it easier for small companies and SMEs to access the often complex bidding process within public sector organisations. If we can achieve this ambition, we can be sure that the benefits will be realised, not just by those who bid for the government contracts, but by families all across Scotland who rely on the success of Scottish business and the impact it has on our local economies.
Thank you very much. Stuart McMillan, to be followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I too am pleased to be taking part in this important debate today, and I want to thank the ICI Committee for bringing it forward, and I commend them for actually doing so. In my role as the EU reporter for the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, I actually wish to highlight the potential impact of changes to the EU public procurement rules upon local government. And at this stage, it's unclear exactly what the final EU directives will include and what impact they will actually have upon public procurement reform in Scotland. As well, the directives have completed their legislative journey through the European Parliament at the end of 2012. They are, as we've heard earlier on, now being negotiated between the Parliament and the European Council. But it cannot be denied that any reform to the EU public procurement rules and any other EU limitations placed on the delivery of shared service arrangements will be of significant importance to local government in Scotland, particularly given that over 40% of all local government expenditure in Scotland is made on procuring goods and services. And local authorities, other public bodies and partner organisations are continually trying to find innovative ways of working together to deliver the best public services. Indeed, in January of this year, COSLA wrote to all of the Parliament's EU reporters identifying changes to EU public procurement rules and other EU limitations to shared services as key priorities for local government in 2013. As members will be aware, the Local Government and Regeneration Committee is currently undertaking the final strand of its three-strand inquiry into public services reform, which is looking at shared services and the development of new ways of delivering services. In late February of this year, the committee agreed to my proposal to seek further information from COSLA as part of the evidence gathering for our inquiry on the potential impact of any new EU public procurement rules and shared services limitations placed upon local government. I have written to COSLA to request that this evidence and look forward to receiving it in due course, and I will of course ensure that the information I receive is also shared with the European and External Relations Committee, the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee and the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee, all of whom will be scrutinising this important aspect of public services delivery. What has become apparent from the evidence to the Local Government Regeneration Committee and our inquiry that Kevin Stewart certainly touched upon earlier is that the EU procurement rules are incredibly complex, and while providing necessary protections to ensure fairness and safeguards in spending of public money upon the supply and purchase of goods and services, the rules appear to actually place fairly stringent restrictions upon the ability of those procuring public service contracts to maximise the effectiveness of these contracts and to find local flexible solutions which are proportionate to need. Now, this Monday, whilst the Local Government and Regeneration Committee was visiting South Ayrshire Council and taking evidence on the Public Services Reform Inquiry, the committee heard from several witnesses about the complexity of the procurement rules and guidance and the impact that these complex rules and bureaucratic processes can have upon communities' abilities to access funding streams and to deliver public service contracts.
I wonder if the member would give way.
Sure. Yeah.
Linda Fabiani. Thank you very much. I just wonder if Mr Macmillan, in recognising that, would also recognise that very often in local situations there's gold plating occurs to European procurement rules. Perhaps because there's a lack of understanding, perhaps because we have such a blame culture and people always looking to have a go, that folk are very, very worried that they have to really go over the top. And does he think it would be useful to have some kind of more level playing field across the country where people would feel confident that they were operating as they should and in the same way as others? Stuart McMillan.
I thank Linda Fabiani for that question, and I actually think that Linda's been sitting in on the evidence sessions that we've heard thus far, because those are actually some of the points that actually have been raised. And the point regarding having a level playing field is one that is absolutely valid, and it's been a strong point throughout the evidence that we have heard thus far. It was pointed out by community representatives from around South Ayrshire, and I'm sure that actually this point would be echoed by community and voluntary groups all over Scotland, that many of the people in the groups involved in delivering vital public services to communities across Scotland are volunteers who simply do not have the huge amounts of time or indeed the procurement expertise to dedicate to these complex exercises. And we have heard of examples where actual processes involved in the procuring services often made it difficult for local companies to compete for contracts. And whilst I do acknowledge that the appropriate protections need to be in place any reforms to procurement processes and rules, which would make it easier for communities, local companies and the likes of social enterprises to access funding streams to deliver public service contracts, often in partnership, would be hugely welcome. In the consultation to the forthcoming procurement reform bill, the Scottish Government proposes to align the definition of major contracts in the bill with definitions used in the EU procurement directives, which, of course, as a principle, makes sense. In its response to the European Commission's consultation, COSLA highlighted that it would welcome higher thresholds being set for all public works contracts, as it is important that procurement processes do not place disproportionate administrative and regulatory burdens upon either contracting authorities or suppliers. The European Commission's view of shared service arrangements in the proposed EU directive is also a concern that COSLA have raised in its response to the Scottish Government's Procurement Reform Bill consultation. Again, as the directive is still not finalised, it is not clear exactly what impact this view may have on local authorities' abilities going forward. To summarise, whatever the final reforms are to procurement legislation and processes, it is absolutely crucial that the reforms support the delivery of best value to maximise the quality and effectiveness of contracted public service delivery in Scotland.
Thank you very much. Neil Bibby to be followed by Nigel Dawn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I refer to my register of interests. I am sure we would all agree that there is always a need for public bodies to spend the public pound wisely. However, the need is even greater in difficult financial times. As has already been said, the public sector in Scotland procures around £9 billion worth of services and goods from the private, voluntary and independent sectors. This is a huge amount of money, and it is nearly the size of the whole amount of money spent on local authorities or indeed the health service. That is why it is vital that this Parliament considers this issue and should seek to consider not only the cost savings to be made, but also, crucially, how procurement can be used to drive up quality and support some of the key objectives we as elected representatives want to see. Objectives such as supporting and encouraging job creation, promoting a commitment to fair trade, supporting the development of small and medium-sized businesses, and encouraging good employment and family-friendly practices. I know that a number of public sector bodies now pay their staff the living wage, and they should be commended for doing that. However, it cannot be right that at the same time they are happy to award contracts to organisations and companies who do not pay their workers the living wage. Public sector organisations can be accused of operating double standards, whereby they apply one set of principles to themselves while permitting others not to meet those standards. I appreciate there is a debate about whether European regulations could prohibit the imposition of this as a mandatory, but in my view we should be doing all we can to promote the living wage through our procurement processes and looking at the use of contract performance clauses. I would therefore urge the Government to work creatively to extend the living wage through public sector procurement, because if the Government does not act, my Labour colleague Kezia Dugdale is keen to introduce a bill to this effect, and because as we understand it from evidence given by Thomson solicitors to the Local Government and Regeneration Committee, this would be possible. Presiding Officer, there has also been significant media coverage on the issue of blacklisting, and I want to congratulate Unite GMB, UCA and their members for being at the forefront of the campaign to expose this shameful practice. I attended a meeting in Parliament over a month ago, and I again met with members of Unite today. The message from those present was loud and it was clear. The trade unions and their members want us to do more than simply condemn this practice by words alone, but by using the opportunity of procurement to eradicate the immoral and illegal practice of blacklisting. People who were denied their right to work and earn a living deserve nothing less. We know there were at least 582 men and women in Scotland who have been blacklisted, some of whom are in this very chamber today. The map drawn up by the union shows people in every part of Scotland affected. In my own region, people in Paisley on blacklists, in Greenock, in Irvine, in Clydebank, Johnston, Erskine, Renfrew, the list goes on and on. People who were driven into poverty, people who suffered from depression, families that broke up because people were excluded from work just because they exercised their basic right to join a trade union. That is why my Labour colleagues and I would propose that we exclude companies who have been found guilty of grave misconduct such as blacklisting in the course of their business activities to be excluded from providing public sector contracts. Regrettably, public sector contracts have been awarded by the Scottish Government and others to companies involved in blacklisting, and we cannot allow this to happen again. I would therefore welcome the Deputy First Minister's commitment to engage with the trade unions, and I hope that this will be done on a cross-party basis, so we can send a message that Scotland is no friend of blacklisters. And I would advise the Chamber that if the Government does not act, then Labour will, and my colleague Neil Finlay, who can't be here today, has asked me to put on record that he will lodge amendments to the procurement bill to stop public contracts for blacklisters if the Government fails to act. And if it is wrong to exclude companies and organisations from public sector contracts who blacklist, it is surely wrong to allow companies who are guilty of tax evasion from doing so also. This is an issue that needs to be dealt with. I understand that many MPs have signed an LED motion in the House of Commons, including members of the SNP, Labour and Liberal Democrats and Greens to this effect, and I therefore anticipate the SNP government addressing this issue in the procurement bill.
1 minute left.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish public sector already saves millions of pounds through procurement, through Scotland Excel and NHS procurement. The question for me now is, what are the next steps? Because once costs have been driven down, the savings on second and third generation contracts are often harder to make. And as I said at the start, making things more cost effective is only one of the benefits. We need to consider how procurement can be and should be used for social and community benefits. I know that Renfrewshire Council has, for example, is already asking those who wish to provide services on their behalf if they are paying the living wage. It is also looking to expand procurement activities to address the issues of blacklisting and tax evasion, and it is also asking questions about whether companies and organisations have family-friendly employment policies and practices and job creations and retention. Similarly, Scotland Excel, I understand, is conducting a round-table on Friday. I understand the Scottish Government officials will be at that, and I hope the Scottish Government will follow the good leads that we are seeing by Renfrewshire Council and others.
Thank you very much. I now call Nigel Dawn to be followed by Jane Baxter.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I have to say this is a fascinating debate and there are many issues being raised by colleagues. Can I say that just for the next 6 minutes I'm proposing to wear the hat of the convener of the cross-party group on construction and address those issues, and those issues alone probably. I also don't recall when I stood up having had the answer to the first question already from the government. I think the Deputy First Minister has been looking at my notes, because the very first thing on my notes is project bank accounts. It's just more likely, of course, that she has been listening to the construction industry, which has been speaking pretty loudly and with one voice on the issue of project bank accounts and retentions, to which I will come very shortly. The issue about project bank accounts, of course, is simply the issue of delay in paying down the chain of supply. As I am assured by the industry that one very large contractor, whom I will not name and probably does more work south of the border than up here, has now told its supply chain that they're going to be paid in 120 days, which is almost never in the context of trying to actually put some cash through your own till. By the time payments get to the lowest rungs, that could well be 150 days. That is 5 months. The longer, of course, a business has to wait for its payment, the bigger the risk of insolvency. I'm told by the same industry contacts that there are currently some 10 insolvencies in the construction industry per week across the UK. Now, once upon a time, we could have said that was something to do with incompetence in the business. But this far into the downturns, I think we can say that incompetence will have gone. The businesses that are now going insolvent are simply those who are being forced there by being squeezed between the banks and the larger contractors who are not paying up their money. And this really is an urgent issue which we do need to address. So I'm absolutely delighted to hear the government is reflecting on project bank accounts. It really is the right direction to be going for major contracts, and I do want to encourage them to do that. This, of course, is not new. It's already happening in Northern Ireland, and indeed the Welsh Government has just suggested that it's going to be going in that direction. If I could then come to the subject of retentions, this is not only about an issue of delay in money getting down the supply chain of contractors, but it's also about protection from insolvency, and the Deputy First Minister knows this fine well as well. A number that you may or may not know is that something like £500 million is currently retained in Scotland. That's money which really should be in the bank accounts of those at the bottom of the food chain, rather than held at the top to keep some of the larger contractors presumably solvent. If that's their model, then maybe they need to change their model. The Deputy First Minister will also know that appropriate amendments to the bill have been drafted by appropriate legal people. They have been put into her department's hands by myself. And I think I need just to say on behalf of the Cross-Party Group on Construction and all they represent that I urge the Government to give serious consideration to how they're going to be able to address this issue. Quite frankly, I am actually being told that to some extent even the legislation will be too late. What the Government really needs to be doing is finding ways in public contracts of making sure the money is pushed down. It's not enough to pay the major contractor in 30 days, as the Government does. It's also absolutely essential that money goes back down through the chain and is not held onto on some spurious grounds about something that hasn't been done. Actually, we're just going to lose lifeblood of our industry.
Chick Brodie. Can I have Chick Brodie's mic?
Trying to be helpful. Have any of the companies that have had this discussion with you looked at finance discounting, invoice discounting, to at least in the short term alleviate the cash flow problem?
Can I say I'm absolutely sure that they will have done, but when you're pricing competitively in the first place, you shouldn't need to be doing that to get paid money that you're due anyway, and I'm sure Chick would accept that. The last point which I'd like to just briefly bring to the Chamber's attention is the idea of integrated project insurance, which is something which I don't think anybody has yet mentioned. Innovation is much easier when you're dealing with really big contracts because you're probably dealing with more professional advisors and you've got an opportunity to get things right the first time round. The idea of integrated project insurance is that all those who are involved in the project, and it starts with the architects, the major contractors and the major suppliers, actually put together a project which they insure as a single entity, and the costs of it are insured as a single entity. That provides a significant reduction in the costs of insurance. And again, I am told that 80% of the costs of insurance actually finish up being paid to lawyers to sort out where the mistake was made, rather than actually doing anything useful for the project. And apart from reducing the insurance cost, which is not insignificant in the construction industry, it also forces those who are involved in a major contract to get themselves sorted out beforehand, to sort out the details, and then to have a contract specification which they can sensibly put their names to and insure as an entity. That tends to encourage folk not to have variations as they go along, to make sure the design is finalised before they go into the contract situation. And that, as everybody in the construction industry knows, is a good way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jane Baxter, to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And thank you to the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee for bringing this debate to the Chamber today, to give members the opportunity to feed into the discussions about reforming our public procurement processes. The high level of responses to the consultation document for the proposed procurement reform bill gives an indication of the breadth and complexity of the subject area. One of the great opportunities of this bill is to create a public procurement system which is fairer and more sustainable. The Scottish Government's own action plan in 2009 recognised sustainable procurement as providing benefits not only to the organisation but also to society, the economy and the environment. These are laudable aims, but unfortunately, over the course of the bill's process, complexity has shifted to concern, as a number of charities have expressed their fears about the loss of sustainable from the title of the bill. As we know, the consultation document contained a section on social and environmental sustainability issues, but as the bill goes forward, it would be reassuring if the potential for procurement to positively impact on the environment and wider society is not lost in a mass of technical reform amendments to existing legislation. Under existing procurement rules over the past few years, we have seen some positive examples of how public money can be usefully spent, and community benefit clauses and specifically contracts focusing on targeted training and recruitment can, if used correctly, enable public bodies to ensure the public spend is used to include skills and employment opportunities for local people. However, sadly, this is not always the case. A high-profile public construction project, just a few miles down the road from where I live, where the issue of opportunities for local people has been the subject of some controversy as the new Forth Crossing. We know that in 1959, 90% of steel used to build the Forth Road Bridge was Scottish, yet in 2012 it was announced by the Scottish Government that the Forth replacement crossing would use steel sourced from China, Poland and Spain. And of the £800 million project, just £20 million in subcontracts were awarded to Scottish firms. As well as illustrating the sad decline over many years in Scotland's industrial and manufacturing capacity, these figures indicate to me that we need a new way of utilising procurement for major public sector infrastructure projects. Yes?
Kevin Stewart.
I thank the member for giving way. I think the member has barely recognised the fact that a huge amount of the manufacturing base of this country has been destroyed by Westminster governments over decades. It is now beyond the capacity of firms in this country to produce the amount of steel and the right steel for the job that she talks about. I think that's a great shame, but she supports the union and the governments that have actually led to the decline in those industries.
Jane Baxter.
I did say that illustrates a sad decline over many years. I would agree we've had a sad decline, so I thank the member for his comments. Too often we see public bodies revert to taking a rigid view of what EU procurement law can and cannot do. And the complexity of procurement legislation and Member States' adherence to EU rules is something picked up on by respondents to the consultation. A number of those who submitted their views highlighted the current work in the European Parliament on the modernisation of procurement rules and the need to ensure there is no conflict between Scottish legislative proposals and those coming from Europe. Given the ongoing debate over the interpretation of European procurement rules, as highlighted by the case of the Forth Crossing, as well as the arguments over the implementation of living wage through contract performance clauses in procurement processes, there is clearly merit in these points being made in consultation responses. And as the European legislation is still ongoing, clarification of how both sets of frameworks, European and Scottish, will be implemented and the timing of each would be welcome. From the ongoing work in the European Parliament, I was pleased to read the proposals from the European Commission for the introduction of most economically advantageous criteria rather than simply lowest cost. This will be positive news to small businesses and voluntary sector organisations who, while providing a great community good in terms of employment and service delivery, may not be able to compete on the same cost terms as a larger bidder.
Final minute.
It may seem common sense to award a contract on the wider sustainable benefits rather than just cost, but unfortunately sometimes this is not the case. We saw an example of this in Fife in 2009, where the Council's contract to deliver mental health services was awarded to a national company and consequently saw several local established mental health groups lose out. Kirkcaldy MSP David Torrance was Vice Chair of Fife's Health and Social Work Committee at the time, and although he's not in the Chamber today, he will be well aware of the impact of the loss of Fife advocacy on the community and service users in Fife. I hope he would agree with me that any steps to avoid future losses of similar long-established voluntary organisations as a consequence of procurement decisions should be welcomed. Given the impact the lowest cost tender had on the mental health service users in Fife and the disruption they experienced in transition to a non-local service provider, then I welcome this concept, and I would welcome a Scottish Government exploring the implementation of value for people further without any proposed legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mike Mackenzie, to be followed by Patrick Harvey.
Presiding Officer, I'd like to commend the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee in securing this debate, and I'm glad to have the opportunity of speaking and of sharing some of my thoughts, which spring from over 30 years' experience running a small business in the construction sector. And I remember around 25 years ago receiving the renewable documents for a contract for services which my company then provided to Argyll and Bute Council. The original contract had run to some 3 pages. The renewal 5 years later was the size of a thick telephone directory. There were 3 copies of this, each to be signed and witnessed. The contract was worth £5,000 per annum, a bit under that actually. And I was reluctant, and my lawyer friends would approve of this, but I was reluctant to sign the document without reading and fully understanding it first. 3 pages into the document, I realised that I would have to engage the services of a whole team of lawyers for at least a month before I could safely sign it. In the end, I solved the problem by the simple expedient of not signing it. This seemed like a good solution, and we continued to provide the service and to get paid for the next 15 years, despite 3 further tendering exercises and 3 sets of unsigned contract documents over that period. And nobody ever noticed that we didn't sign the contract. Presiding Officer, I think this epitomises much of what is still wrong with public sector procurement in Scotland. It's often overly bureaucratic and disproportionate to the size of the contract. I'm happy to acknowledge that we've made some much progress actually in Scotland, and that our record compares well with the rest of the UK and with a lot of the countries in Europe. However, I think it's absolutely right that we should strive for continual improvement, and there is no question, I think, that improvement is required. Much of the problem seems to stem from risk aversion, and I know of 2 fairly recent and significant projects in the Highlands and Islands where the main contractor went into liquidation shortly after beginning the work. In each case, the subcontractors and the supply chain of smaller local firms were significantly out of pocket. In each case, the contracts cost much more to complete. So we need in the procurement process to get much less risk-averse and much more risk-aware. And we need a process that properly manages risk and all of the risks. And one good way of managing the risk, for example, is the unbundling or the disaggregation of larger contracts, because this not only spreads the risk, but it gives smaller local companies a better chance of winning contracts. Smaller contracts, too, are often less attractive to predatory firms who are very good at dealing with the bureaucracy, but sometimes much less good at actually carrying out the work. And smaller contracts and helping smaller businesses help Scotland to achieve what the economists refer to as churn, the process by which the big, fat, lazy cats are replaced by lean, mean and hungry cats, the process that drives innovation, both necessary ingredients in any successful economy. Rural areas like the Highlands and Islands present particular challenges for project delivery, particularly on our islands, and it is almost always the smaller local firms that are best at negotiating and dealing with these challenges. In terms of aftercare and warranty work, I have often found that firms from far afield are understandably reluctant to send operatives out to far-flung places. So we need to focus much more on outcomes and quality of outcomes and far less on process. This is especially so in tendering architectural work, because even our most successful architects tend to work within small companies, and if we can't capture quality at the design stage of a project, we'll not achieve it further on in the delivery process.
Final minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The great thing about a small country like Scotland is that we can drive this process of reform and continual improvement forward faster than larger countries can. This Parliament has already delivered procurement processes that better than many other countries. Think what we could do with all the levers of innovation and reform at our disposal.
Thank you very much. And I call Patrick Harvey.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I add my thanks, as others have expressed, to the committee for bringing this debate. The Deputy First Minister talked about a tension that can exist between different priorities in this subject, and I think there are several examples of that kind of tension that have come through the debate. One, I think, as Mike Mackenzie hinted at, is the tension between legal compliance and risk aversion, which can be simply ends of a spectrum. There's a tension between the question of in whose interests does procurement law and competition law actually operate. Does it operate in the interests of the common good and the public interest, or does it simply serve the interests of private sector competitors? Is it genuinely something that can benefit the wider common good? A tension between legislation and culture change. Do we need the one to drive the other? Can they be self-reinforcing or mutually reinforcing? And a tension, as the Deputy First Minister put it, between giving opportunities to small businesses in Scotland through our procurement legislation or approach to procurement and the priority of value for money. And value for money, as several members have argued, must not, cannot simply be seen in terms of the direct financial transaction. It's that kind of reductive approach, seeing only that part of the economy which shows up in money terms, which is at the heart of a great part of our economic problems at the moment. If procurement decisions create unintended consequences which undermine public policy or the common good, we can't really call a cheap price value for money. Now, all these tensions in the subject were raised when the Greens brought a motion for debate in the Chamber back in 2007 on green procurement. And we were asking for the Executive, as it was then, to bring forward guidance which hadn't previously existed on the new EU rules as they were at the time. The directive had come in force some year before that, and there wasn't yet guidance. Well, the government added that guidance to their website. If I remember rightly, they added that guidance to the website the evening before the debate, so progress was made even before we got to the Chamber. But we were also calling for mandatory requirement on sustainable procurement criteria to be added in public contracts. And again, there was this tension between mandatory requirement, legislative requirement and culture change. We argued that the one can drive the other. Members have mentioned a wide range of criteria that they would like to see included. And I agree with many of the comments from the Labour benches about wanting to see as many of these as possible specified in the legislation. Whether that talks about the environmental performance, which can be measured in a range of ways, from waste production to CO2 efficiency per unit of output, whether we're talking about the ethical aspects such as trade justice and indeed issues which I've discussed with the Minister for External Affairs, Hamza Yusuf, about whether it's appropriate for public bodies to bring in wider international issues such as boycotting particular products in relation to the Israel-Palestine situation. Many local councils have begun to move away, for example, from Eden Springs on ethical grounds in terms of the water in their public buildings. We'd like to be able to see greater specificity on that. So the environmental, the ethical and indeed the economic justice arguments as well. And those economic justice arguments don't just stop at the living wage. They do include issues such as blacklisting, which has been mentioned before, and wider positive engagement with the trade union movement, which we would like to see, which I hope we would all like to see responsible employers supporting. An approach to zero-hours contracts, for example, and a very exploitative model of employment which I hope we would be able to address. Not just the living wage, but maximum wage ratios. How much more radical do we want to get? Actually start to ensure that the private sector, not just the public sector, reduces the gap between the richest and poorest in our society, and a range of opportunities for employee participation. All of these could be specified, and the Minister may well say that it wouldn't be possible to do that, even within a future iteration of the EU legislation? Well, the suggestion I would make, and I hope that the Deputy First Minister will respond to this in closing, if we can't specify all of those things, can we then ensure that there is a mandatory requirement for generic criteria, that a company bidding for a public contract would have to demonstrate economic justice, and that the government may have regard to the living wage, to zero-hours contracts, to union recognition and workers' participation as part of that overall generic criteria. I've been looking at the correspondence between the Commission and the government on the issue of the living wage, and it does appear to me that the question has been about that issue specifically rather than something more generic, and I would suggest that the government respond to that. And in closing, Deputy Presiding Officer, also I would call for strategic intention to be specified in the bill, so that as EU rules change, not just this year but into the future, local procurement decisions are made with the greatest possible duty to make the most possible use, the most allowable use of sustainable, ethical and economic justice requirements in all future contracts. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Just before I call the closing speakers, can I remind the Chamber that it is courteous to be present for all opening speeches when members intend to contribute to a debate, and also not only is it courteous, but if members are not present for opening speeches, then they are in danger of being dropped from the speakers list. I now call on Alex Johnson. 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. The decision by the committee to bring this matter forward for debate means that we are starting the process of dealing with the Procurement Reform Bill rather earlier than might normally be the case. And while that's not unprecedented, it's certainly something I think that has been an advantage in this case, as has been ably demonstrated by the range of interesting angles that have been taken during the course of this debate. Now, I start from a position where I share the view that was expressed by the Cabinet Secretary herself, in that the process that we have at the moment has its qualities, but it could be better. In fact, if there's anything characterises the procurement process, it is that there have been more than one attempt in the past to make this as good as it could be, and that each attempt has thrown up difficulties that were, in some cases, largely unforeseen. So we have a process which needs to be properly applied, needs to be worked appropriately, but we have a challenge to ensure that happens. Now, I come from a slightly different position from some within the Chamber, in that I would actually like to see more public services put out for tender. And that means that we need a robust system in place to ensure that as local authorities start to deal with the problems of dealing with reduced budgets, and in some cases within Scotland, it has to be admitted that there is actually problems in terms of recruitment, because we do have a labour shortage in some parts of Scotland where it is difficult to find people to do work in-house. The result is that we have a process in place that will, in my view, become more and more important as time goes on. So, as we look at one of the things that's been discussed widely during this debate, of course, is the whole idea of EU procurement rules and the framework that surrounds that. Now, I think we have a serious problem to address, in that we in this country have, and other people have said it, a habit of gold-plating European regulation. In fact, the effect is that in Scotland we have tended to take the view that something might be outside the EU procurement rules, when in fact it's not. And quite often there is evidence from other countries, sometimes competitor countries, of how they apply the rules in a wholly different way. So the challenge for us is to make sure that we have a fair process in place which allows Scottish companies appropriate and adequate access to the available contracts, but also ensures that we don't put at risk our access to other countries' contracts by being too severe on the way we treat other companies. Yes, indeed, I'd love to.
I talked previously about the difficulties round about custom and practice. Does Mr Johnson think that maybe some of the gold plating that goes on is because of previous custom and practice round about the daft CCT rules that we used to have to follow?
Alex Johnson.
I think that there is There are certainly problems with the way we've dealt with this in the past, and I think I made that clear that I believe that in my opening remarks. However, we have an ongoing problem, and that is our tendency, mentioned by a number of speakers already, to be risk-averse in how we handle these things. Now, there is a genuine problem of risk aversion in the award of public sector contracts, and I think that is best epitomised by the way, in fact, when bids are taking place, private sector bidders will go right to the line in order to achieve an advantage and to win a contract, whereas those who are negotiating the contracts on the public sector side are risk-averse and will give the line a good wide berth. So there is a different understanding of where they need to be. But the whole issue of the award of contracts is something that we must consider in another slightly different way. Because unlike what some of the speakers in the Parliament today may think of my views, it's not only getting public services into the private sector that is my concern. I also have a concern to ensure that voluntary sector or third sector organisations have the opportunity to provide the quality services that they can and to bid to provide these services within the structure we create. And that's where we have to get this right, because too many of the stories I've heard from private sector and particularly the voluntary sector, where organisations are very small, it's trying to fit through the portal, trying to get into the system that is the difficulty. It's been said, and this is anecdotal, that if you're a company who's big enough to have an individual full-time or perhaps a whole department dealing with procurement issues, then that job will be done. If you are a one-man company or an organisation run by a small group of volunteers, the opportunity to engage with the process is made more difficult by virtue of the fact that you cannot devote yourself to that full-time. So, Presiding Officer, it is my view that this is a vital process that we're entering into, that there is a great deal to be gained, and I take confidence from the fact that, apart from a few speakers who have perhaps flown off at a tangent, we are all singing from the same hymn sheet on this, not least the views that were expressed by Nigel Dawn. Scotland's construction industry is currently in a very difficult position, and it has the potential to create a great many jobs and training opportunities for our young people. By getting it right, for construction in particular, we can achieve a great deal. So the Government will have my support in principle, and I look forward to going forward with this process and producing a bill that would deliver effective procurement for Scotland's companies.
Thank you. And I call Elaine Murray. Take 6 minutes.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I think there has been a fair degree of consensus during this debate. Several members, for example, have commented that the bill cannot be a panacea for all ills of procurement, and yet there is a big opportunity here in using public sector procurement to social and economic benefit as well as to the benefit of business. And many members have also commented on the fact that best value is far more than just achieving the lowest cost, and that cheap price is not necessarily value for money. And in particular, the level of spend can have a major impact on society and the environment. Many members spoke about the advantages of enabling smaller businesses to be able to access public sector contracts more easily. There were a number of different examples around this, and many which seem to reinforce some of the points that Jim and Margaret Cuthbert have made. Margaret McCulloch, for example, described how smaller businesses can be squeezed out and reduced to sort of trying to get the less lucrative subcontracts rather than having access to the more lucrative parts of the contract. Tavish Scott gave us a concrete example from his own constituency of North Hubco, where the tendering process for the new school has lacked transparency and where there seems to be very little information as to whether or not local businesses were even involved, never mind managed to get the contract. And Taggart described to us the importance of enabling small businesses because of the local employment opportunities that they can present, that indeed that access to public sector contracts can allow these businesses to grow and to increase local employment opportunities. Nigel Dunn drew our attention to project bank accounts and retentions, the problems of late payments to smaller subcontractors by major contractors, and the delays in money getting down that food chain to those smaller contractors who really need them. And Jane Baxter gave us a particular example about the loss of the Fife Advocacy Service because of procurement decisions, which meant that people with mental health issues were no longer able to access the services which they needed. Now, as many members said, one of the reasons quoted is the bureaucracy of the procurement process. Linda Fabiani and others mentioned the pre-qualification process and how it can be onerous and repetitive, and I think we all welcome the fact that the Government intends to take action on that. Nigel Dunn again mentioned integrated project insurance. In fact, that chimed with some of the issues raised by the FSB report, which reported that insurance requirements are often disproportionate for smaller businesses. The bill's consultation itself favoured the prohibition of charges for the issue of tender documents, as these can actually deter smaller businesses. And indeed, one of the larger companies at the seminar to which I referred in my opening speech actually said, Morrison's Construction says that actually the cost of bidding can be disproportionately high, as much as £1 million for a £40 million contract. So there are a number of issues in there which can be problematic for small businesses. Many members also talked about the ethical obligations which can be included in procurement legislation. Several members made reference to taking action against those companies involved in the insidious practice of blacklisting and the opportunity that could be presented to encourage the payment of a living wage. There seemed to be some dispute between members actually as to how this could be achieved. I was interested that Chick Brodie said that he had some legal advice that indicated that it would be necessary, and indeed Neil Bibby also referred to advice of Thompson's solicitors, so I think this probably actually could bear additional scrutiny as to how far you're able to do this. But I think there is a consensus, certainly between Labour and the SNP, that we do need to see how we can use legislation to counter this heinous practice. And I welcome the commitment to work with the trade unions on that one. And Patrick Harvey actually brought in an interesting additional issue around the possibility of excluding zero-hour contracts, which again I think is an insidious practice often perpetrated on young workers. And I do hope actually there might be an opportunity when this briefly is.
Mike Mackenzie.
Do you appreciate that employment law is a reserved matter to the UK and it would be their place to do that and not ours?
We're actually looking at not excluding zero-hour contracts, which you can't do, but whether there's a possibility through the procurement process to exclude those companies which actually operate that type of practice. So that's actually what I'm talking about. There's much discussion around the EU directive. I have to say, I agree that there is often a rigid view, maybe a gold-plated view about what you're allowed to do within the terms of EU directives. And as Kevin Stewart said, the barriers which are perceived to be there sometimes actually aren't there. And indeed, if you have a look at Jim and Margaret Cuthbert's report, which John Mason also referred to, they give a number of examples in different EU countries where they have actually been able to break down and use national legislation to enable procurement to be broken down into smaller lots, which are more accessible to smaller businesses. I think that there are a number of other issues which maybe we would want to look at, whether the importance of unsuccessful tenderers, particularly smaller businesses, getting feedback and debrief information so that they know why they didn't get the contract, and also the opportunities to grow small businesses, to actually anticipate, look forward, anticipate where there are gaps in local provision and see what action can be taken in order to fill those gaps. So I think this bill does present us with a lot of opportunities to investigate some of these issues further and to see how these can be reinforced through the legislative process.
Thank you very much. And I now call on Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary. 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This has genuinely been a very good debate. I think I have literally taken something positive from every contribution, and I want to thank members, even from Alec Johnson, which is something in itself. I want to thank members for their contributions. It will be very useful to us as we finalise and refine the content of the bill. Apologies that I won't reference everybody's contribution in my summing up. I simply don't have time to do that. Elaine Murray said at the outset of the debate that she was quite surprised at the high level of interest in this debate. Like Kevin Stewart, I'm not surprised. I think all of us know from our constituency experience just how many frustrations and barriers, perceived or otherwise, that businesses feel that they face in the procurement process. And I think we've all got an obligation to respond to that. The fact of the matter is, procurement spend is one of the most powerful economic levers that we have at our disposal. We need to use it to support the economy, to promote sustainability, to help businesses to grow. But we also have a duty to taxpayers, and that duty is to get the maximum value for money out of that spend. And some of what we've heard expressed as concerns this afternoon do arise from that obligation to get value for money. There has been talk about tensions. I spoke about tensions. John Mason, Patrick Harvey and others have done so. And there's inevitable tensions at the heart of this agenda. But I believe that if we do it properly and if we make some of the changes that are being talked about, then there's also a lot of synergy between these apparently conflicting aims and objectives, because, as has been said by many speakers in this debate, value for money is not just about cutting costs. If you support sustainable growth, then that in itself is delivering value for money. I was struck by Kevin Stewart's contribution when he said, and I think he's got a point here, that perhaps there's not the understanding that there should be of that concept and definition of value for money, which leads me to another point, which is a point John McClelland, whose work, of course, kicked off the progress towards the bill that we will debate shortly. He often talks about the importance of capability and capacity in those who do procuring in public authorities, to make sure that they have the professionalism, the knowledge and the understanding, and that's something that I think is important, to give them the confidence to apply the common sense and the gumption that Kevin Stewart spoke about. I think Mike McKenzie, in what I thought was an excellent speech, also made an important point about the importance of helping SMEs win contracts. It's good for them as businesses. It's obviously good for the economy because of that. But it is also often the case that it will deliver better quality of work and better aftercare in terms of some of these contracts as well. So I think these are all important points. I want to just address some of the particular issues that were raised during the course of the debate. Elaine Murray raised a concern that I know has been expressed about a perceived shift of emphasis in this bill, and I just want to take the opportunity to reassure members that there is no shift in emphasis away from sustainable procurement. I mentioned, and others have mentioned, ethical procurement, which is an important part of that sustainable approach. But in my view, good procurement will be sustainable procurement, and sustainability, whether that's environmental, social, economic, for me sits at the heart of what I would describe as the value for money triangle, which is cost, quality and sustainability, and that is at the heart of our approach to procurement, and it should be at the heart of the bill as well. Mary Scanlon mentioned commissioning of care and support services, which is very important. We published guidance around this in September 2010, and the European Commission proposals also recognise the specific circumstances pertaining to social care procurement, and we recognise the need to very carefully consider this as we take forward the bill, and I hope it reassures members to know that CCPS is represented on the bill sounding board, and obviously will take close cognisance of their views. A number of members, as indeed I did, Chick Brodie and others, mentioned EU law, and Stuart McMillan, I think, gave us a very helpful update on his perceptions of the European developments. I understand the frustrations about EU law. I have some of those frustrations sometimes, but our companies benefit from open markets, and what we must do is make sure that we are operating maximum flexibility within the rules that we have. Linda Fabiani, Mike McKenzie, others mentioned a risk-averse culture. We need to make sure that we are taking sensible, proportionate approaches, and we also must lobby for change where we think that change is essential. And I won't surprise anybody to hear that I agree with Kevin Stewart, that if we were represented at the top tables of Europe, then we might be more effective in lobbying for some of that sensible change. Margaret McCulloch, I'm very tight for time, so if you can be quite brief here.
Patrick Harvey. Thank you. I wonder if the Deputy First Minister would respond to the suggestion I made that a strategic statement of intent would ensure that there is maximum flexibility. We don't lock in current practices.
There would be more chance of me getting to that point if Patrick Harvey hadn't intervened to ask me, but I will do it now. That yes, I will give specific consideration to that point. Margaret McCulloch, Nigel Dawn mentioned the situation of small companies further down the supply chain who make the outlays but have to wait lengthy periods of time to get paid while the money sits in the bank account of principal contractors, and that's why I was pleased to announce what I did today around project bank accounts. Nigel Don makes a very important point about retentions. He has given me the draft amendments to legislation, and will consider those very carefully. Linda Fabiani, Tavish Scott, John Mason and others rightly said that the bill, important though it is not the be-all and end-all, but I do believe it will allow us to accelerate progress, further simplify processes, put sustainability centre stage, and make sure that good practice, like standard questions, for example, are not optional. They are required of public bodies buying goods and services. I was glad there was a recognition throughout the debate of the progress we have made. I won't repeat the statistics I cited in my speech, but suffice to say, when it comes to getting contracts to SMEs, we actually do better than other parts of the UK. Not good enough, but we do better. I take the point about the definition of SMEs, which is why I made the point in my opening speech about the proportion of our spend that goes to companies with employees of fewer than 50. There is, though, room for improvement, and Alec Johnson and others made that point. I just want to, in the minute or so I have left, briefly say where I want to see improvement as we go through this process. Firstly, greater simplification, transparency and standardisation, and level playing field. Many of the complaints I hear are not about firms that lose out in the tender process. They are from firms who feel that they are not able to get into the tender process. I think that was the point Tavish Scott was making. We must deal with that. Secondly, to ensure that procurement spend is a force for good, that we are supporting the economy and its constituent parts, that we are promoting good practice and sustainability and ethical behaviour. And I noted the points John Mason made about social enterprises, and I can say to Neil Bibby I am more than happy that our approach to blacklisting is taken forward on a cross-party basis with the trade unions. I think that is important. And my final point is that we do have to ensure value for money in the broadest sense of that term, because the more value for money we get, then the more we get for our money. And the more we get for our money means that the more contracts we can have and the more work there is for companies in the first place. So I again want to thank members for what has been a very useful debate and say how much I am looking forward to continuing these discussions as we take forward the bill.
Thank you very much. I now call on Maureen Watt to wind up the debate, and you have until 4:59.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I think holding this debate has been extremely useful, and I'm sure committee members will take on board the comments of members when the bill comes to the committee for scrutiny. I'm sure we'll be making sure we have copies of the official report, because we might not be able to keep all the points raised in our heads until June or whenever the bill comes forward. But can I thank you all very much for your contributions. As folk have already said, the interest in this bill has been very high. The number of briefings from a huge variety of organisations has been one of the highest I think I've known, and from a very broad range of organisations, from charities such as Skiaf and Oxfam to care organisations, construction and other business organisations, and even the BME into the ethical procurement of surgical instruments. So, as Linda Fabiani and Tavish Scott said, expectations on this bill are high, and I'm not sure that all will be met, but I can assure you as a committee we will make sure that we can try as far as possible to listen to and accommodate all those. Like Elaine Murray, I attended the David Hume Institute seminar on procurement in January and was impressed by the amount of interest shown there and the enthusiasm for meaningful change that was shown by the speakers at that event and at the informal discussions afterwards. There we heard about the importance of sharing good practice in public procurement and the willingness of a variety of organisations to do that. We heard about the concern of the cost of quality bids from prospective contractors and how high that can be, sometimes in the region of £1 million for a £40 million project. Now, these costs are, of course, ultimately paid for by the public purse as part of the overall contract costs. And in some cases, the bid costs are also paid out to unsuccessful bidders. which is not unreasonable, but again it adds significantly to overall costs. So perhaps it would be worthwhile trying to identify any steps that could be taken to reduce or streamline the work required to formulate and deliver bids, and therefore reduce the overall project costs. As has been mentioned, when the bill is introduced, it is anticipated that the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee will conduct formal scrutiny at stage 1. We will certainly be looking at all areas of the public, private and third sectors to fully engage and directly engage with us in relation to the formal scrutiny of the bill, and we will seek to work with the various representative bodies on how we might best encourage this engagement. However, in addition, I fully expect that the committee will seek to identify opportunities to hold informal discussions with representatives of all sectors to hear suggestions for improvements which would make a meaningful difference to the ability of all sectors to engage with the procurement process in the future.
Convener, could I ask you to move the microphone slightly round? Thank you. And could I ask other members to please respect there's someone speaking.
We also recognise the very clear and legitimate interest which other parliamentary committees will have in the bill provisions, and the committee will of course be more than happy to discuss these with committees as to how they might contribute to the scrutiny of the proposed bill. And it was interesting to hear from members who thought that there are bills currently going through Parliament which may want to take some of the points of debate that we've had today in scrutinising their bill, for example, the Health and Social Care Bill and the Community Empowerment Bill. If I look at and try and identify the themes that have come out throughout this debate this afternoon, I think the points that raised by Chick Brodie, Kevin Stewart and Linda Fabiani and others about breaking down the barriers and stop putting conditions in place which are risk-averse or just there to cover people's backs. It's about asking the questions. It's about challenging existing practices. Are they delivering the best for the taxpayer, for the user, for the local businesses? And I was very interested to hear Mike Mackenzie's experience, and I liked his quote about not being risk-averse, but being risk-aware, because the financial viabilities of the businesses and the organisations that are tendering for work is absolutely vitally important, and often I feel that third sector organisations are subjected to much more scrutiny than private sector organisations, and I really don't think that's fair. And I think it was important that people raised the idea that sometimes people hide behind EU procurement rules. And I think it's very important that before awarding contracts, there's a full understanding from the bidders about what's required in the contracts. And I was interested that the Minister for Transport said that when there was a public meeting about the contract for the AWPR, there were a huge number of people there at the meeting interested in finding out what the contract was all about. And I take on board the comment that Elaine Murray just made in her concluding speech about the need for feedback, so that organisations feel that although they haven't won that contract, that they can tender for future contracts. Can I say to Tavish Scott that I also had raised at that David Hume Institute seminar my concern about hubs and consortia. I think there is a role for Scottish firms to come together in consortia so that they can bid for the large contracts. But I also have a feeling that there may become too much of a cosy situation between companies that have got the major contracts and bodies who are putting out contracts feel that they will just go with the contractors that they know. So that will be something that I personally will be keeping an eye on when we come to scrutinise the bill. Many members mentioned the living wage blacklisting and tax avoidance, and there was a lot of hot air around these, as well as shedding some light.
Order, please.
In terms of the living wage, I think the public sector, and particularly the Scottish Government, has made significant progress on leading on the living wage and making it much more what should be the norm rather than not in other companies. And in terms of blacklisting, as a former HR professional, it is just such sloppy HR practice in having to think that companies should deal with blacklisting companies and not doing their own recruitment to a higher level of scrutiny if that's what is required. And I think in terms of tax avoidance, we've seen the public lead by example on this, on boycotting the companies that have been trying to avoid tax. I was pleased to hear what the Cabinet Secretary said in her closing remarks about the sustainability issue. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, this has been an interesting and worthwhile debate, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary has listened closely to the points that have been made across the Chamber, as have the members of the committee, and I thank you all again very much.
Thank you very much. That concludes the debate on motion number 6153 on public procurement reform, and it is now time to move on to the next item of business, which is consideration of business motion 6236 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a business programme. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against the motion to press the request to speak button now, please, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6236.
Formally moved.
As no member has asked to speak against the motion, I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 6236 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are. The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of business motion 6237 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau, setting out a timetable for consideration of the Scottish Independence Referendum Bill at Stage 1. Could I ask any member who wishes to speak against that motion to press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6237.
Moved.
As no member has asked to speak against the motion, I will now put the question to the Chamber, and the question is that motion number 6237 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are agreed, and the motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of a Parliamentary Bureau motion on designation of a lead committee at Stage 1 of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill, and I would ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 6238.
Formally moved.
Thank you. The question on that motion will be put at decision time, to which we now come, and there are two questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that motion number 6153 in the name of Maureen Watt on behalf of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee on Public Procurement Reform be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are, and the motion is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 6238 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on the designation of a lead committee be agreed to. Are we all agreed? We are, and the motion is therefore agreed to, and that concludes decision time, and we will now move on to members' business. Could I ask members who are leaving the chamber to please do so as quickly and quietly as possible? Thank you.